Karen lights napkins on fire at diner table to get Waitress's attention. The morning sun had barely reached its peak when the line outside Maple Grove Diner stretched past the picket fence and into the adjacent parking lot. Inside, the air buzzed with the hum of conversation, clinking cutlery, and the occasional holler from the kitchen staff. It was Sunday brunch, the busiest time of the week, when families, elderly couples, and tired night shift workers all converged for pancakes, bacon, and coffee strong enough to revive the dead. The waitstaff moved with choreographed chaos, weaving between tightly packed tables and booths, balancing trays piled high with plates of steaming food and glasses slick with condensation. Amid the joyful bustle of the brunch rush, the front door burst open with a sharp jingle of the bell, and in strutted Karen Monroe, adorned in oversized sunglasses, an aggressively floral blouse, and a scowl that had been resting on her face since sunrise. Karen stormed up to the hostess stand, where a teenage girl with a frizzy ponytail and too much eyeliner looked up from the reservation book and offered the usual rehearsed smile. "Hi there, welcome to Maple Grove. Do you have a reservation?" Karen scoffed so loudly that a nearby couple turned to look. "I don't need a reservation. I've been coming here for years. I always sit by the window, booth, away from the kitchen smell, and I'm not sitting next to children." She punctuated each sentence with a dramatic sweep of her hand, flashing her bejeweled bracelet like a badge of entitlement. The hostess's smile faltered, but she managed a polite nod. "We're very busy this morning, ma'am. The wait for a booth by the window is about 20 minutes. Karen's lips curled downward, her sunglasses sliding down her nose just enough to reveal piercing eyes scanning the room like a hawk. 20 minutes? That's unacceptable. I'm a paying customer. Isn't that old man over there done? He looks like he's been nursing the same toast for an hour." "I'm sorry, ma'am," the hostess replied, her voice tight. "We'll get you seated as soon as possible. You're welcome to wait by the benches." Muttering about incompetence and the death of customer service, Karen turned and plopped herself down on the wooden bench, crossing her legs dramatically as if to make a point. Her phone came out almost instantly, and she began typing furiously, alternating between a scathing Yelp review and social media posts blasting the pathetic state of local businesses. By the time her name was finally called, she had composed 3 lengthy rants and snapped a photo of a fly on the window to include in her review. The waitress who led her to the booth was young, clearly exhausted, and had the kind of strained expression that suggested she'd already dealt with more Karens that morning than anyone should endure in a lifetime. Karen slid into the booth with a huff, plucked up the laminated menu, and waved the waitress off before she could speak. "Just water, and make sure it's cold, with a lemon wedge. I don't want any of that lukewarm sink water nonsense. I'll order when I'm ready." The waitress nodded wordlessly and disappeared before Karen could add any further instructions. Karen glanced around the room, already annoyed by the squealing children 2 tables over and the smell of bacon wafting from the kitchen. She pulled a napkin from the dispenser, dabbed her forehead like she was fainting from heat, and then sighed as dramatically as possible. She waited, and waited, and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Other tables were served, plates were delivered, coffees refilled. Laughter echoed across the tiled floor, but Karen's booth remained devoid of attention, save for the sweating glass of water with a suspiciously small lemon wedge. Her eyes narrowed as her frustration began to boil over. She flagged down a passing busboy who froze like a deer in headlights. "Where is my waitress?" she snapped. "I've been sitting here ignored like some beggar in a soup line. I could have died from dehydration. Are you all blind or just incompetent?" The busboy stammered something about being a dishwasher and hurried away. Karen fumed, tapping her fingernails on the wooden table like a woodpecker on a sugar rush. She looked down at the napkin still in her hand, then at the flickering candle centerpiece nestled in a faux wood holder beside the salt and pepper shakers. A twisted smirk crept across her face as a devious idea took root. "I'll show them," she muttered, half to herself, half to the invisible audience she imagined was always watching. She rolled the napkin tightly like a fuse and carefully lowered one end into the candle flame. For a second, nothing happened. Then a faint crackle. Then a tongue of fire leapt up, orange and hungry. Karen held the flaming napkin aloft like Lady Liberty gone mad and shouted across the diner, "Now you'll notice me." The reaction was instant and explosive. A collective gasp shot through the room. Diners leapt from their seats, knocking over chairs and plates. A toddler screamed. An elderly man ducked beneath his table. The staff scrambled in confusion, someone yelling for water, another shouting for the fire extinguisher. A pitcher of orange juice was flung toward Karen's table, dousing the fire in a citrusy splash that only added to the chaos. The fire alarm blared a few seconds later, shrill and unrelenting. Red strobe lights flashed along the ceiling as the automated voice system began instructing everyone to evacuate immediately. The restaurant descended into pandemonium as people jostled for the exit, covering their ears and dragging children behind them. The cooks poured out of the kitchen, some still wearing hairnets and carrying spatulas. Through it all, Karen sat smugly in her soaked booth, dripping in juice, arms crossed like a queen who had just delivered a royal decree. She surveyed the havoc with an air of satisfaction, as if the disruption was a perfectly reasonable price to pay for her right to be acknowledged. The waitress reappeared, soaked and seething, eyes wide with disbelief. Karen met her glare with a cool smirk and muttered, "See, that's how you get service around here." The fire trucks arrived within minutes, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the sidewalk. Firefighters burst in to clear the smoke and inspect the scene, baffled to find that the only fire had been a single napkin set alight by a customer who refused to leave her booth. The police were right behind them, and it didn't take long for a drenched, sticky Karen to find herself surrounded by two unimpressed officers asking her to stand and put her hands behind her back. She began protesting immediately, launching into a tirade about lazy staff, neglect, and how she was forced to take drastic action to be seen. But the handcuffs clicked shut before she could finish her monologue. Outside, the crowd watched as Karen was led away in handcuffs, screaming about lawsuits and how she'd own this place by the end of the week. Someone had caught the entire thing on video, and already the clip was being shared, tagged, and commented on faster than the police could finish filing the incident report. The waitress stood by the doorway, arms folded, watching as the woman who had tried to burn her way to attention disappeared into the back of a squad car, her legacy now permanently tied to a napkin, a candle, and one very bad brunch. The police station reeked of bleach and stale coffee, a mixture that clung to the walls like an unwelcome guest. Karen Monroe sat stiffly on the plastic bench in the holding room, her arms folded tightly across her chest, the handcuffs now removed but the red marks they left still visible on her wrists. Her blouse, once loudly floral, was now crumpled and stained with drying orange juice. Her hair frizzed at the edges, and her sunglasses, long forgotten in the shuffle, were tucked into an evidence bag along with the lighter she claimed she never used. The officers who brought her in had long since stopped reacting to her tirades. For the first hour, she had demanded to see a supervisor, then a lawyer, then the mayor, as if one of them might agree that setting a napkin ablaze in a public diner was somehow a civil right. But by the time the third officer ignored her, she realized no one was going to come rushing to her defense with a bouquet and an apology. Now, she sat brooding in silence, face tight with indignation, jaw clenched like a steel trap. In the next room, Officer Ramirez typed steadily at his desk, summarizing the incident report with robotic efficiency. Suspect ignited cloth napkin using open flame. Resulting fire triggered alarm system. Evacuation occurred. Suspect made no attempt to put out fire. Suspect then verbally escalated situation. He paused, glancing at the notes scribbled from witness statements, and added with a slight shake of his head. And expressed pride in her actions, stating, quote, "Now they know not to ignore me." He saved the file and forwarded it to the city attorney's office, where decisions would be made about the severity of the charges. Given the number of witnesses, the recorded video that had already gone viral and the disruption caused, it wasn't a simple misdemeanor anymore. There was talk of public endangerment. Some even suggested she could face charges of aggravated arson, though it would depend on whether prosecutors felt they could prove intent to cause harm. Meanwhile, outside the station, the world was already forming its opinion. The video of Karen lighting the napkin, flailing it like a torch, and shouting at the waitress had amassed thousands of views in just a few hours. It was shared on Twitter, plastered on Facebook, clipped for Instagram Reels, and dissected on Reddit threads. Commenters tore into her appearance, her entitlement, and her total lack of remorse. Memes began circulating before she'd even been fingerprinted. Someone edited the video to include explosions and dramatic music. Another dubbed in a dramatic movie voiceover, calling her the flame of entitlement. The internet was never forgiving, and Karen had become its latest chew toy. Back at home, her teenage son, Tyler, sat on the edge of his bed staring at his phone in disbelief. His friends had already sent him the video with dozens of laughing emojis and sarcastic captions. He didn't even need to open it. He knew his mother's voice from the screeching alone. The whole school would see it by Monday. He sank his face into his hands, mortified beyond words, while his phone buzzed again with another group chat notification. In the kitchen, Karen's sister, who had been staying with them temporarily after a surgery, paced nervously while the local news anchor recited a summary of the diner incident, flashing a blurred image of Karen's face alongside a shot of the Maple Grove sign. She grabbed her car keys and sighed, knowing she'd be the one stuck driving down to bail her sister out. Back in the holding area, Karen was finally called up to the front desk by a bored clerk who barely looked at her. "Your bail been posted," he mumbled, sliding a clipboard forward. "Sign here and you can go. Don't lose the court date notice. It's stapled." Karen scrawled her signature with a huff, muttering about wrongful arrest and legal consequences for this farce of an ordeal. As she stepped outside into the harsh afternoon sun, shielding her eyes and blinking in surprise at the small crowd of reporters and curious onlookers clustered behind the barricade, she momentarily froze. Someone shouted, "Hey, fire starter," and laughter rippled through the group. Camera phones lifted, flashes popped, and questions were flung at her from all directions. "Do you regret what you did? Was it worth it? Are you going to apologize to the waitress? Did you intend to hurt someone?" She hissed like a cornered cat, ducking her head and shoving past the crowd, only to be intercepted by her sister's beat-up sedan pulling up to the curb. The passenger door flew open and Karen dove in without so much as a greeting. As they sped away, her sister glanced sideways, lips pursed. "Do you want to explain what the hell you were thinking?" Karen rolled her eyes and waved the question off. "I was being ignored. They made me wait 25 minutes for service. 25. It was psychological torture. I didn't hurt anyone. I just wanted attention." Her sister scoffed and gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Well, congratulations. You've got it now. In fact, the entire country knows your name. You're trending." Karen's jaw dropped. "Trending?" she repeated, a flicker of excitement briefly overtaking her scowl. "As in famous." Her sister gave her a look of pure disbelief. "As in infamous. You're being called the human dumpster fire. Some guy made a parody song about it. Even Grandma saw the clip. You're not a celebrity, you're a joke." Karen turned away, arms crossed again. "They'll come around. When the truth comes out, when they see how mistreated I was, they'll realize I was right. I'm the victim here." But deep down, even she could sense the tide turning. No one at the station had sympathized. The staff at the diner hadn't groveled. Not one news anchor referred to her as anything other than a disruptive customer. The usual safety net of righteous outrage and entitlement felt thin this time. And the worst part, she was going to have to go to court, with real lawyers, a real judge, and possibly a jury full of people who had watched her wave a flaming napkin around like a lunatic. As they pulled into her driveway, Karen noticed a neighbor across the street watering his lawn. He looked up, caught her eye, then shook his head in disappointment before turning back to his hose. That small gesture stung far more than the mocking questions or the camera flashes. Karen stomped up the porch steps and slammed the door behind her, seething, humiliated, but still clinging stubbornly to the idea that she was the one owed an apology. Inside, her son stayed locked in his room, headphones on to drown out the sound of her voice as she complained to her sister about the fools in law enforcement and the idiot girl who poured juice on her couture blouse. But none of that would matter soon, because in less than 48 hours, Karen would receive the formal court summons detailing the charges against her: attempted aggravated arson, reckless endangerment, and obstruction. The state wasn't letting this go, and soon, Karen would find herself not in a diner or behind a trending hashtag, but under oath, answering to a judge who wouldn't be so easily ignored. 2 weeks later, Karen sat at the polished wooden table in her lawyer's office, her lips tightly pursed and arms folded like she was preparing for battle. The room smelled of leather and printer toner, and though the blinds were drawn, the bright morning sun still bled through, casting sharp lines across the stack of papers before her. Her attorney, Martin Wexler, a man in his late 50s with thinning hair and a perpetual expression of mild annoyance, sat across from her and flipped through a yellow legal pad filled with scribbled notes and printed screenshots of news headlines, social media posts, and public reactions to the infamous napkin incident. He cleared his throat as if it might soften the blow he was about to deliver, but Karen didn't notice. She was too busy adjusting the collar of her newly purchased designer blouse, carefully chosen to give her the look of a professional woman unfairly dragged into scandal. "The prosecution is coming hard," Martin said bluntly, finally lowering the pad and meeting her eyes. "They're charging you with attempted aggravated arson, reckless endangerment, and obstruction of justice. They offered a plea deal: misdemeanor reckless conduct, 6 months probation, a public apology, and community service." Karen scoffed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "A public apology, community service. I should be the one getting an apology. I was the victim of gross negligence. I waited nearly 30 minutes for service, Martin. That waitress should be on trial for endangering my emotional health." Martin pinched the bridge of his nose, taking a deep breath before responding. "Karen, the entire thing is on video. You lit a napkin on fire and shouted like a lunatic in a crowded diner. There were kids there, elderly people. One woman claims she fell during the evacuation and sprained her wrist. A toddler had a panic attack. You are not the victim, not in the eyes of the court, and not in the eyes of the public either." She leaned forward, jabbing a manicured finger at the file on his desk. "That video is taken out of context. They didn't see what came before. They didn't see how I was treated. I was ignored, Martin, mocked. I had no choice." Martin's jaw tensed. He'd been through dozens of difficult clients before, but Karen was in a league of her own. Her inability to see fault in herself bordered on delusion. Still, he was her lawyer, and it was his job to keep her from making things worse. "Regardless of how you feel, this is no longer just about your feelings. You're being portrayed as a public menace. The video has over 6 million views. You've been turned into a meme." The jury pool is going to walk into that courtroom with opinions already formed. The plea deal is generous, considering how ugly this could get if we go to trial. Karen shook her head violently. "Absolutely not. I will not grovel for forgiveness like some criminal. I'll fight this. I'll testify. I'll tell them exactly what happened. I have rights. I am not going down because of some greasy spoon diner and a waitress who couldn't do her job." Martin closed his notebook, a tired sigh escaping his lips. "Then we go to trial. But you need to prepare yourself, Karen. This isn't reality TV. This is a court of law." Meanwhile, across town, Natalie James sat at her modest kitchen table, carefully highlighting key points in the witness statement her legal aid attorney had helped her draft. Her 2-year-old daughter napped in the next room, a rare moment of peace in an otherwise turbulent week. Since the incident, Natalie had been flooded with media attention, both sympathetic and invasive. Donations poured into a GoFundMe started by a local blogger, and the diner offered her paid leave. But the emotional toll had been heavy. She kept replaying the moment in her head, Karen's crazed expression, the flash of fire, the rising smoke, and the terrified scream of the toddler behind her as the alarm blared. She'd done her best to shield customers from panic, to usher people out safely. And yet somehow, she was now preparing to testify in a courtroom like she was part of a true crime episode. Her attorney, a young woman named Dana with sharp eyes and a calming presence, sat across from her reviewing the statement. "You're doing great," she said, her voice low and soothing. "The prosecution will probably ask you to describe the events in detail. Just stick to what happened. Don't embellish, don't speculate. You have the truth on your side." Natalie nodded slowly. "It's just scary. She looked at me like I was less than human, like I was her servant, and now she's going to be standing there trying to make me look like I deserved it." Dana gave her a supportive smile. "Let her try. Her behavior is on camera. You're not the one on trial here." The court date arrived swiftly, the city courthouse buzzing with anticipation. Local news vans lined the curb outside, reporters clutching microphones and camera crews adjusting lenses. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense, the gallery filled with curious spectators and journalists hungry for soundbites. Karen arrived dressed in a subdued navy blazer and skirt, her hair professionally styled and her makeup immaculate, trying to project the image of a composed and misunderstood woman. Martin stood beside her at the defense table, offering whispered reminders to stay calm, to let him speak unless spoken to directly. The judge entered, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled tightly into a bun. She wasted no time in calling the court to order and reviewing the charges. The prosecution began with a powerful opening statement, framing Karen's actions as reckless, dangerous, and entirely unnecessary. They described how one act of entitlement could have resulted in catastrophe, emphasizing the panic and injury that followed. Martin, in turn, gave a carefully worded rebuttal. He leaned on Karen's character, her frustration, her emotional distress, and attempted to minimize the threat posed by the fire. "It was a momentary lapse in judgment," he said, his voice smooth and calculated. "A desperate plea for help from someone who felt abandoned in a crowded room." But when the video was played, there was no room left for interpretation. Karen's voice echoed through the courtroom. "Now you'll notice me," as flames licked the edge of the napkin and the candlelight cast dancing shadows across her smug face. The room fell uncomfortably silent. Even Martin didn't try to speak afterward. No words could twist what everyone had just seen. Natalie took the stand next. Her voice trembled at first, but as she recounted the fear, the chaos, the moment she shielded a crying child with her own body, her tone grew stronger. She never exaggerated, never cried, never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her truth, laid bare, was more powerful than any performance Karen could muster. As Karen sat there, watching Natalie's calm, grounded testimony dismantle the defense's narrative, for the first time a sliver of doubt crept into her mind. She looked out at the jury, ordinary people, many of them visibly disturbed, and realized that none of them were nodding in her favor. They weren't buying the narrative of a mistreated woman seeking fairness. They were seeing her for what she had shown herself to be, a woman who set something on fire because she didn't get her way. And suddenly, Karen wasn't so sure she was winning anymore. As the trial continued into its second day, the atmosphere in the courtroom remained as heavy as the dark oak paneling that surrounded it. Karen sat motionless at the defense table, lips drawn into a tight line, her eyes fixed straight ahead but betraying the flicker of tension growing behind them. The confident posture she had walked in with on day one had eroded into something stiffer, more rigid. Her perfectly styled hair now seemed like a flimsy costume piece, a sharp contrast to the plain clothes worn by the witnesses and courtroom staff who spoke with quiet authority and unimpeachable authenticity. Martin Wexler, her attorney, shuffled through a stack of carefully prepared notes and whispered strategies. but it was increasingly clear to him that the mountain they were trying to climb had grown twice as tall overnight. He could feel the room's temperature change with each testimony, not literally, but in the way that subtle size, body language, and courtroom silence began shifting against them. The jury, composed of 12 citizens who had started with politely neutral expressions, now wore faint scowls or tired eyes whenever Karen's name was mentioned. She was no longer just the woman on trial. She had become something else in their minds: entitled, reckless, and worst of all, unapologetic. The prosecution's next witness was the diner's manager, a stout, balding man named Peter Havorson, who had worked at Maple Grove for over 2 decades. He spoke slowly, clearly, his deep voice steady as he recounted the moments leading up to the fire alarm, the rush of fear that had swept over the staff, and the sheer disbelief he felt when he saw a customer deliberately holding a flaming napkin in the middle of a crowded restaurant. He described the chaos that followed, the spilled drinks, the fallen chairs, the terrified children, and the frantic call he had to make to emergency services while trying to keep the employees calm. He was professional, composed, and absolutely damning. When asked by the prosecutor how he would describe the defendant's demeanor after the incident, Peter didn't hesitate. "Smug," he said flatly, looking directly at Karen. "Like she'd accomplished something, like she'd proven a point. She didn't seem scared. She seemed proud." Karen shifted uncomfortably, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, but she refused to look away. She held Peter's gaze with a mixture of defiance and disbelief, as if stunned that he would dare portray her that way. In her mind, she had never meant to scare anyone, not really. She had just wanted the staff to take her seriously, to acknowledge her, to validate her. But hearing her actions through someone else's voice made the scene feel different, less like a protest, more like a tantrum. And worse, a dangerous one. Next came the woman who had sprained her wrist during the evacuation, a retired nurse named Eileen Madsen who had been dining with her grandchildren when the fire broke out. She recounted the moment with trembling hands, describing how her grandson, just 4 years old, began crying and screaming as the fire alarm sounded and people rushed past them. In the commotion, she lost her footing and fell, injuring her wrist while trying to protect the boy. Her voice cracked as she described how he had nightmares for days afterward, terrified of restaurants and loud noises. The courtroom was still as she spoke, the jury leaning in slightly, the emotional impact thick in the air. Even the judge's stern expression softened momentarily. When asked if she had anything she wished to say directly to the defendant, Eileen turned in her seat and looked at Karen with tired, watery eyes. "I hope you understand that people got hurt, that this wasn't just about you. That some things can't be undone with a shrug or an apology after the fact." Karen looked down at the table, her expression unreadable. For once, she didn't roll her eyes or whisper angrily to her attorney. She just stared at the wood grain, the rhythm of the testimonies hammering slowly at the wall she had built around herself. Martin, sensing the shift, leaned in and quietly asked if she wanted to consider revisiting the plea deal, perhaps negotiate new terms before the jury delivered a verdict. But Karen waved him off without speaking, her pride too rooted in her spine to bend, even now. When the defense's turn came, Martin did what he could. He called a friend of Karen's, a former coworker who described her as passionate and opinionated but not dangerous. He tried to redirect the narrative toward her emotional state that day, arguing stress, poor judgment, and momentary frustration. He emphasized that the fire had been put out quickly, that no lives were lost, that the actual damage was minor. But for every point he tried to make, the prosecution had a counter. The video didn't lie. The reactions of the victims didn't lie. And most of all, Karen's own words, shouted proudly in the heat of the moment, could not be walked back. The final moment of the day came when Karen herself insisted on taking the stand. Martin had advised against it, warned her of the risks, the potential for self-sabotage. But she wouldn't be silenced. She believed she could explain that if people just heard her side, they'd finally understand. She adjusted her blazer, stood with a practiced poise, and took the oath with conviction. At first, she was composed, describing the brunch as crowded, the staff as inattentive, the conditions as intolerable. She painted herself as a woman pushed to the brink of exasperation, desperate for basic service, unfairly treated and dismissed. But the longer she spoke, the more cracks appeared in her story. Under cross-examination, she faltered. She tried to blame the waitress. She tried to blame the manager. She even suggested the alarm system was too sensitive. The prosecutor, patient and deliberate, slowly dismantled each excuse. When asked directly if she regretted her actions, Karen hesitated. It was a second too long, a beat that stretched through the courtroom like an echo. "I regret that it escalated," she finally said, her voice flat, "but I don't regret standing up for myself." That moment hung in the air, a silent confirmation of everything the prosecution had claimed. No remorse, no accountability, just defiance and pride. The jury scribbled notes. The judge narrowed her eyes, and Martin closed his folder, knowing there was little else he could say. As the court adjourned for the day, Karen sat back down beside her attorney, visibly rattled but still clinging to her belief that she had done nothing wrong. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Microphones pointed at anyone who would speak. Natalie left through the side exit, escorted by her lawyer, avoiding the chaos, holding her daughter's hand as they walked toward the waiting car. She didn't need to hear the verdict to feel a sense of closure beginning to take shape. The truth had been spoken, and now it was in the hands of the jury. Inside, Karen remained frozen in her chair long after the judge had departed, staring at the empty jury box, the weight of the silence pressing down harder than the handcuffs ever had. For the first time since it all began, the possibility that she might not walk away from this unscathed began to settle in. And in the stillness of that courtroom, surrounded by people who had once only been background noise in her carefully curated life, Karen began to realize that attention, real, lasting, public attention, came with a price she never expected to pay. The final day of the trial arrived under a gray, overcast sky that matched the mood hanging over the courthouse like a shroud. Reporters stood clustered by the main entrance, their breath fogging in the early morning chill as camera crews jockeyed for the best angle. Inside the courtroom, the gallery quickly filled with curious onlookers, legal interns, and concerned citizens drawn by the spectacle that had captured national attention. Karen Monroe sat at the defense table, her expression unreadable, a carefully composed mask that had begun to crack at the edges. She wore a plain black suit today, more funeral than formal, her hair tied back tightly as if trying to hold something deeper in place. Martin Wexler sat beside her, hands folded over a legal pad he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. There was nothing more to argue, nothing more to spin. It was in the jury's hands now. The jury had been sequestered overnight to avoid media influence, and their return was brisk, businesslike, and heavy with finality. As they filed in and took their seats, not a single member looked at Karen. She stared at them anyway, searching for signs, clues, anything to suggest she might still walk away from this unscathed. The judge entered shortly thereafter, her gavel striking once, echoing through the chamber with the force of inevitability. She nodded to the foreperson, a middle-aged woman in a red blazer whose face bore the solemn weight of speaking for 12. "We, the jury in the case of the state versus Karen Monroe, find the defendant guilty of reckless endangerment in the first degree," the woman announced, her voice clear, unwavering. "We further find the defendant guilty of obstruction of justice and guilty of attempted aggravated arson." Karen did not gasp. She did not cry. She did not even blink. She simply stared straight ahead, jaw clenched so tightly her neck trembled. Martin closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them again with a slow exhale. He'd expected this outcome, and in some strange way he was relieved. There would be no more rationalizing, no more pretending the courtroom hadn't seen what it saw, heard what it heard. The video, the testimonies, Karen's own arrogance had made the verdict a matter of when, not if. The judge thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. Then she turned her attention to Karen, her eyes sharp and her voice clipped with restrained fury. "Ms. Monroe," she began, "you turned a simple wait for brunch into a public emergency. You endangered the lives of strangers, terrified children, caused injury, and then proceeded to show not an ounce of genuine remorse. Your entitlement does not excuse your actions. Your lack of empathy does not justify your disruption. You have been found guilty on all major charges, and this court will now determine an appropriate sentence. Karen's lips parted slightly as if to speak, but Martin placed a hand gently on her arm, shaking his head once. Now was not the time for outbursts. The courtroom held its breath as the judge listed the sentence. 18 months of supervised probation, 500 hours of mandatory community service, a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation and anger management counseling, restitution payments to those injured during the evacuation, and a public apology to be read in court that day and submitted to local media for publication. There would be no jail time, but there would also be no escape. Karen would be tethered to the consequences of her actions, her name now synonymous with one of the most senseless acts of public disruption in recent memory. Her pride had won her notoriety, but the cost was high and non-negotiable. The judge turned the floor to Karen. You have the opportunity to make a formal apology to the individuals affected by your behavior, she said. You may read the written statement your attorney submitted. Karen took the paper Martin handed her. Her hand trembled slightly as she unfolded it. She rose slowly, stood before the court, and glanced down at the words she had refused to write herself. Martin had prepared the entire statement, careful to use language that acknowledged wrongdoing without inflaming her already volatile personality. She read it aloud, voice low and robotic. I deeply regret my actions on the morning of the incident at Maple Grove Diner. I understand now that my behavior was not only inappropriate but dangerous. I recognize the fear and harm I caused to innocent people, including children and staff members, and I offer my sincerest apologies to those impacted. It was never my intention to create such distress, and I accept full responsibility for what occurred. She folded the paper when she was done and looked up, but no one clapped. No one nodded. No one smiled. The courtroom was still, and if anything, her mechanical delivery had only confirmed what the trial had already revealed, that Karen did not believe she had done anything wrong, only that she had been punished for not playing along with society's rules. After the sentencing, the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving behind a handful of reporters typing up breaking news alerts. Outside the courthouse, Natalie stood with her daughter in her arms, surrounded by friends, coworkers, and a local councilwoman who had publicly supported her during the trial. She hadn't attended to gloat or revel in victory. She simply wanted to see it through to the end, to witness the conclusion of something that had haunted her every time she closed her eyes. She felt no joy watching Karen walk past in a silent, rigid shuffle, flanked by cameras and murmurs. Only relief. Relief that it was finally over, that her voice had been heard, and that something resembling justice had prevailed. Karen, for her part, exited the courthouse with the same stiff pride she had carried in with her weeks ago. But it was different now. People recognized her for the wrong reasons. A few shouted remarks. One man sarcastically offered her a napkin. Someone else took a video, but this time there was no laughter, no meme potential. The buzz had faded. Now there was only embarrassment, a slow-burning humiliation that no public statement or courtroom suit could shield her from. Her phone had been returned to her after sentencing, but it remained in her purse, powered off. She didn't want to see the headlines. She didn't want to hear what people were saying. At home, her son refused to speak to her, barely making eye contact as he passed her in the hallway. Her sister had already packed her things and returned to her own apartment, leaving behind a note that simply read, "I love you, but I can't defend you anymore." The neighbors avoided her. The local grocery store staff suddenly seemed too busy to help. Even the dog park regulars a few blocks away whispered when she walked by. The community service began the following week, picking up trash along the freeway in a reflective vest that screamed penance louder than any courtroom ever could. Karen worked in silence under the supervision of a corrections officer who treated her with professional indifference. The sun was hot. Her hands blistered, And every time a car slowed down to get a look, she flinched, wondering if it was someone recording her shame for another 15 seconds of viral fame. But no one cheered, no one noticed, and that perhaps was the final punishment. The very thing she had demanded so fiercely, attention, had finally turned to ash just like that burning napkin. And in the silence that followed, Karen Monroe was forced to sit with what remained. Not fame, not validation, but the cold, enduring consequence of being noticed for all the wrong reasons.